Today we have Shane Hunt joining Ashton Rouska and I. Shane has totaled 2160 in a meet with a 500-pound bench press and a 900-pound deadlift. We talk about lifting philosophy, SBD days, mobility, injuries, training methodology, and much more. Let's roll into it. All right, I got a good question to go in. For anyone watching, I'm using some of Tim Ferriss's interview questions because I think they're spectacular. All right, so I'm gonna have both of you answer this. So what purchase of $100 or less has had the most impact on your lifting? And when you describe like the item, if you can give like the brand and model, where you found it, et cetera, that'd be super helpful.
$100, yeah. No squat shoes, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if the Adidas squat shoes I have are under $100.
I think my first pair were probably about $100. The Rogue Dew Wins. I think they were probably about 100, maybe a little more though. I'll think of something better than that though. Let me think.
Yeah, sure. I was just sitting here thinking, I don't think there was really any sort of specific item that I bought, that like really just changed the trajectory of my lifting. I think, more so, I think sometimes people focus a little bit too much on equipment or, type of equipment and they become a little less focused with, just like lifting weight, especially when they're a lot newer, So I think under $100, the best thing that you could do for yourself, if you're trying to become a better lifter, is like, try to muster up at least, maybe about half of that or so a month for a gym membership. So that way you got a place to go to train if you don't have access to the weights at home, which a lot of people don't. So that would be sort of the investment that I would recommend and think about. It's simple, it's intuitive, and it seems obvious, but a lot of people who want to like get stronger or get more fit aren't even willing to do that sometimes. So it just needs to be said.
I agree. I think a lot of people spend a lot of time worrying about the best belt, best shoes, best sleeves, all this hype around the insert sleeves. And, maybe there's something to be said for some of that equipment. You want to relatively be on the same playing field, but it's not going to make or break you, like Ashton Rouska is not Ashton Rouska because of his SBD belt,
If they weren't powerlifting, do you think they should even use equipment at all?
I think the equipment would differ, I think it would be less important maybe for having like a powerlifting belt, but having something like elbow sleeves. I know a lot of bodybuilders, they might benefit from using that. But I'd say if you're not a strictly kind of compete in powerlifting and you're just strength training, you probably could get away with just a belt. I think the belt would be more important than the knee sleeves. And I think that was actually what I would choose for I wouldn't say it was the biggest, like change the trajectory of my lifting, but I do think that getting a belt, learning how to properly brace and everything is a huge aspect of maximizing your potential and, fully displaying how much strength you have.
The interesting thing with the belt too was like, I think like if you just like kind of suck at bracing, which some people or a lot of people do, and it's not really the most intuitive thing in the world necessarily. I'm kind of just like thinking about what you just said. Having a belt, and not like an expensive $200+ belt, but just having any belt really can help sort of reinforce and teach that just sort of that pattern of bracing, bracing properly, bracing 360 degrees and things like that. Not just incorporating, some people think, oh, I'm bracing, I'm pushing out my abdomen, but no, there's obliques, there's erectors, there's lots of other things that are around there that you can certainly use as a part of that bracing mechanism to like lift weight the most efficiently. And, if you've had trouble doing that without a belt or don't know how to really to do it, or it's just not intuitive, having some piece of equipment there that you can go into in all directions may be helpful for some people. Not a requirement by any means, like at all, but it could be a useful tool in helping to learn and reinforce that pattern and yeah, that's kind of how I feel about that. But no, not really a lot of equipment I would say is required. Since you did bring up bodybuilding though, I do agree with the comment on elbow sleeves. You're just kind of you're working to you're trying to achieve hypertrophy through a lot of like the lifts, and a lot of dudes in bodybuilding, will tend to work their upper body, a lot more than their lower body. And if you're, benching, inclining, overhead pressing, and then doing like a million accessories that all involve sort of like those similar regions, then yeah, just having that probably makes it slightly safer. I know for me, even like with benching, since I bench like really close right now, and I do it like 3 days a week, there was a point where I got really heavy on all 3 days, and lo and behold, I had some elbow discomfort, and then I started using the elbow sleeves, and honestly, almost immediately, like 1 to 2 sessions, almost immediately alleviated like 80 to 90% of that discomfort. So just something to throw out there.
I thought about something that when you were mentioning the belt to learn how to brace, I realized that whenever I'm attempting to brace and I don't have a belt on, I imagine I'm wearing a belt. And then I think about having the belt and how I would push out against it. And that's how I brace whenever I'm not wearing a belt. And I never really thought about that before.
Now, see, yeah. So you have the schema, you have the mental representation of wearing a belt, and you're using that to brace when you're not wearing it. Yeah. So people who've ever worn one don't have that same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Shane. So I'm curious, like we've talked a bit about it with Ashton in the past couple episodes, but for you, how would you describe your philosophy behind lifting? And then how does lifting fit inside of your entire life?
I would say it's changed a bit, especially the stronger I've gotten. I'd say the more conservative I've had to be with training. And I've notoriously gone, really, really hard in training before. And I've reaped some benefit from that, but I've also paid a little bit of a price for that. Is a fine balance, I think. So for me, just finding a better balance where training is meant to grow you, to build you, and the training itself, while it's a slight demonstration of your current strength, the goal is to get stronger. So really embodying that growth mindset, using the training to get stronger versus it being more of like an ego thing, like I'm going to go lift this to hit a PR, which is obviously the end goal, but finding more joy in like the process versus being so obsessed with the end goal, I think has helped me a lot, especially with just being patient and not forcing numbers. I think obsessing over numbers, while it is the end goal, you can get lost in that. And there are certain times when you just can't force more weight on the bar. You'll run into a brick wall. So I think for me, just lifting is a huge part of my life, but using it to grow myself versus let's go see how much I can do on any given day has been a big thing for me. That's led to ultimately more progress in the long run.
Yeah. That's a great answer. No, I totally can relate to that and agree, man. That's like, it's a long-term growth mindset. And when you do get stronger, you do have to be more careful. I know I can relate. A lot of my training now is a lot more boring and conservative than it used to be. Which, I'm okay with, and I've come to terms with all that, but in my mind, it's still the long game. It's still long, like, okay, like, so if this meet is in, several months or several weeks from now, am I going to be stupid today? And we've all been stupid before. I think all three of us, or, most other strong people to some extent. Like, am I going to be dumb today, or am I going to, stick to the plan, put on the boring weight, focus on, every aspect of the lift and try to make it as efficient and as, just as efficient as quality as possible, and, continue to place the, sort of the building blocks for that ultimate, skyscraper or tower that you're trying to build. It's so important. And you know, a lot of ego lifting, especially at the strength level that you're at and that I'm at as well. It really can wear down on the body, just significantly increase your risk, like for injury, and makes it a lot harder to progress in the long game as well. So it can be tough.
So when both of you mentioned being more conservative compared to maybe how you used to lift in the past, are you referring more to volume, frequency, or intensity? And how exactly have those changed over time?
I would say mostly intensity, and because typically people are gonna potentially, if they're that kind of person where they, you know, they do want to demonstrate their strength. I have a high inclination for that. I want to see how strong I am, so I have to kind of hold myself back. So leveraging more volume, more frequency can, you know, lead to you being able to do more intensity later on. But I think for me, that's something that I would normally neglect, is doing as much volume. But when you shift that focus to more of like the growth, you know, using it to leverage more growth, I think that's when you start to see that when you play with frequency and volume, you can get away with a lot more, not get away with a lot more, but you can be a lot more productive. Whereas with intensity, if you're going, you know, 85+% really, there's only so much you can do. Whereas with volume, I feel like you can, like Ashton was saying, you can build a massive foundation, and then you can, you know, build to the top from that massive foundation.
Yeah, exactly. And I like what you said. You can leverage, you know, those other sort of tools. If like you find that you are really, you know, high on intensity, you can leverage those other tools, you know, sort of frequency and volume. I know for me historically, it was mostly intensity as well, but there were times where frequency and volume were kind of involved too. And sometimes you just kind of have to stop and you know, sort of evaluate and assess, you know, what your goals are, evaluate and assess how you're going to get there, make a plan. Um, I always like to say you should always have a plan, but you should never marry a plan. So, you know, that just means, you know, have a plan, have an idea of, you know, how you're going to get to where you want to be, but be willing to be flexible and adapt as circumstances arise. So that's sort of how I feel about it. And if you begin to develop, more you begin to develop that mindset, the less you are, the less that you are sort of encouraged or obsessed with, you know, going outside of that sort of that realm of thinking, and, you know, pushing your training extra hard, like with intensity or other things like that, would push you outside of that realm. So the less you're sort of encouraged to do those sorts of things, the more you begin to, like, I think, adopt that mindset. Like the temptation is obviously still there sometimes, like, you know, every once in a blue moon, you know, another way you could also think of it, you know, play the devil's advocate is, oh, I feel really great today and I haven't felt great in weeks or months, you know, like on this specific lift, you know, if I don't see what I'm capable of, maybe I've wasted this day. And while that type of thinking, you know, may seem somewhat logical and may seem sort of true, at the same point in time, you know, you still have to have the end goal and the end game in mind. And you know, testing that day or seeing where you're at, you know, does it ultimately contribute to the goal? Does it, you know, hinder your ability to achieve that goal? Or um, you know, like you just have to weigh sort of the risks of what you're doing. Some things are more risky than others, and yeah, take that for what it's worth. Assess risk. That's another big thing.
So like kind of thinking about that idea of, you know, the idea of like taking the good day when it comes, but sort of like moving it over to when you think in terms of like time horizons, as far as like for goals that you have, do you think in terms of I want to hit X, Y, or Z within a couple months, or is it a year, or is it the entire lifting career? Like in what term, like what time horizons do you guys tend to think in?
So time frame of goals, right?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure for Shane's case, but I know personally for me, I set goals in multiple sort of different there's short term and there's like medium term and there's long term targets, right? So, short term targets is I have a meet in Korea in next month, actually, about a month and 4 days from today. So that's kind of a short term target. And, I have, training that's kind of structured and pretty specific to that meet. And I'm trying to, stick with that and follow that. And that's a lot easier to do because the short term goal is so close, right? And I don't want things to to not go well or to fall apart. Um, and then there's also, of course, like the medium term targets. That's where you start to talk, and this depends on the person, it's a subjective, like some people, a year might be a short term, goal. But in powerlifting, in my opinion, a lot of people don't even compete for a whole year or longer. So I don't consider it a short term. I consider that more of like a medium going on even long term sometimes, because as you're training each day throughout that whole year, it's sometimes really hard to see that meet that's a year or a year and a half away is coming towards you, until it's 2 months, 3 months out, 4 months out. So then I'll have, of course, sort of training goals and things I'd like to accomplish in the medium term. Consider that like like a three to like 6 month period. And then the long term, when it's like 8 months to a year or beyond that, I'll kind of have different, sort of goal sets for that as well. And that's sort of how I like to take it now. Like, when I was younger, you know, and thought I was, invincible, it was kind of like, oh, well, by this age, I should be able to do this. By this age, I should be able to do that. By this age, I should be able to do that. And I've completely let go of that mentality. I've thrown it out the window. It doesn't serve me well. I just try to, focus on those short, medium, and long-term goals as I define them. Long-term being that year, 8 months to a little bit over a year and a half. And I don't like to go too far beyond that, because there are a lot of things that can happen, and there's a lot of things that have happened in my life, even in the last 6 months, that have really affected my lifting and training that have nothing to do with powerlifting. Things that I couldn't have predicted. So it's just kind of like, I have to kind of take it in strides. And if I can take it within like a year time frame or a few months, it's a lot more manageable to set goals and chip away that way, while still thinking about the long-term plan. But again, have a plan, but not marry one, especially for the really long-term goals in powerlifting. Because a lot of people, again, like I said earlier, just don't last super long in powerlifting for whatever reason, a lot of times reasons they don't even see coming. So I kind of like to take that short, medium, long-term approach as I defined it.
I agree. I think it is really important to have those stages. Like I have like lifetime goals that I do want to hit, ever. But I try honestly not to think about those so much. Especially I was dealing with a little bit of a just back injury, discomfort in my back. So when you're in that place and you're thinking about, I want to deadlift 1,000 pounds one day, it can be very discouraging, because you're like 315 is hurting. How am I going to do 1,700 pounds more one day? And like getting kind of stuck almost in that mindset of this is the way it's going to be forever, with injury, is something that I think is a lot of people fall into that trap. But I think when you're in that place, you have to be able to establish shorter term goals. Like deadlifting pain-free is a goal at that point. Like and almost the smaller you start, the bigger you can build that goal. If you start with a lot of just very small wins, small successes, you can build upon those, and they kind of compound off of each other. So there was a certain point, I mean, at the low of the low, where it's like, I want to be able to just not be in pain, just doing a short like jog. I want to be able to rotate my torso and not have any discomfort. And then I've built upon that. And yet a few days ago, I did like a mid 700 pound deadlift, and I was pretty happy with it, even though it's far from my best. It's still a step in the right direction. It was pain free, so I consider it a win, and I can go on to progress from that.
Yeah, I saw it. I know what you're talking about. I saw it the other day. It looked really good. It looked efficient and didn't look like you were in pain. So I was like, this is a big step in the right direction.
I was very happy with it. I was really happy with it, even though it's like, it's nowhere near obviously the end goal.
Right.
I think you have to have that kind of perspective where it still is a win. It's still a success. And there's more growth to be had, you know?
Yeah, there's a lot more there. That was good.
I like the idea of how I kind of visualize it as, let's say I'm not sure which way is left or right here, but like you're making your way up, it's almost like a stock market graph. And then, something happens, some injury, and then you get down to here. And a lot of people are just upset because they know it was up here before, and then now it's down here, and they see that gap. Whereas it sounds like for you sort of reset your parameters to where now you start going, all right, like how can I get up to here again? And then you just kind of climb back up. And like you mentioned, like trying not to think about up here all that much and just kind of keep your mind state down here.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I've read a few books that like endurance athletes. I've read a few of their autobiographies, and I do think that it's huge having that mindset of like the next step versus the end goal. Like crossing the finish line is the goal, but you have to kind of get within that, the next step, the next lap. I was reading Diana Nyad's book. She swam from Cuba to Florida, and it took her like, she did it 5 or 6 attempts before she finally did it. She was 64 years old when she did, and I believe she's still one of the only people to ever do it. And she was saying she would just get lost in just the next stroke, swimming, not thinking about the end goal, trying to find a process, find a way to just get lost kind of in that. I think that's huge.
Wow. She swam from Cuba to Florida.
How many miles is that?
It should be around 90, but I think she actually ended up swimming a little bit over 100 miles. It took her 56 hours, 54 hours. She loses like 30 pounds, like just being severely dehydrated. It's insanity. It's absolutely, it's unbelievable. It really is.
Yeah,
unbelievable.
That's amazing. It's also the irony there, being severely dehydrated, swimming through a body of water, but not really.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If only it was fresh water.
Yeah. No, but yeah, wow, that's one, that's awesome and fascinating. And two, the stock market example that you just brought up, I do think that powerlifters, if we're sticking with that analogy, I think that powerlifters, despite it not being an endurance, sport necessarily, by definition, I guess, powerlifters should not be day traders. You know what I mean? We need to zoom out on the graph and look at trends and realize that the progress isn't always so linear, but sometimes it's kind of like a zigzag, and sometimes that zigzag goes a little bit down, and sometimes it trends upward, and also realizing that it won't trend upward, always, and it won't trend upward always at the same time for all 3 of your lifts too. Because I know it's really hard at this stage to get all 3 things to just move positive momentum in one direction without anything going wrong at any point. It can happen. It's still every now and then it'll happen, but it's just things to think about as you're training and as you're going along in powerlifting.
Yeah, I think that longevity aspect is huge. And if you look at it, like a lot of amazing lifters over the last, I don't know, however many years, whatever time span you want to choose, there's been a lot of phenoms that have come and gone, and it's almost they're never heard from again. And they got strong really, really fast, and then it's kind of like they maybe have rushed the foundation. I mean, maybe there's a lot of reasons why that happens, but I think it is fairly common to see these absolute like outliers, genetic freaks, whatever you want to call them, but they're very short-lived. And then there's some people that, Ashton, obviously like yourself, that have lasted. You've already been in it for a decade, and insanely consistent. So I think longevity is something that's overlooked. And like I really like the day trader analogy.
Yeah.
Powerlifters should be day traders. You should put that on a shirt.
Yeah. Trademark it at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree, man. Like, there's a lot. I mean, you see it now, even, especially now, actually more than you did even 10 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 years ago when we were kids, like, like teenagers. Like now, there's lots of kids that are coming, that show up and they're really strong, and then you know, a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road, and they're replaced by other kids that are, you know, strong and doing their thing, and then those kids are replaced, and they just kind of keep replacing each other, but none of them really stick around long enough to break records or to, like, you know, win or like be the best. Or if they do, it's very short lived.
As you get stronger, powerlifting is a way different game than what it is in the beginning. When you first start your first year, you know, you're gaining like anywhere from 20 to 40 pounds of muscle, your strength skyrockets, and you're just constantly on a tear. And then even year 2, year 3, you can keep that up. It slows down a little bit, but now you're climbing in the hundreds of pounds, so you're happy about it. But once you get to a higher level, it becomes an injury management game. It becomes a very long, thought out, like, you're taking a lot of time to build these little wins. And then, like Ashton mentioned, like your squat, bench, and deadlift aren't necessarily all going up at the same time anymore. And the whole flavor of it changes. And I think a lot of people, they really enjoy it when it gets to that, because it brings a new level of difficulty to the game. But I think other people, it's not the instant gratification anymore, and that's not really a game they want to play as much at that point.
Yeah, that's very true. The approach, the mindset, the way of thinking really does change later on. And you know, if you're making all these crazy gains early, and especially if you're, you know, like a teenager, you know, like you're a kid doing it, you know, 2, 3 years into the game, let's say you start at 17 years old, 2, 3 years into the game, you know, you're 20. You're still really, really young. And you know, you still want to just get jacked and strong and do all this stuff. But you know, let's say you start slowing down a little bit at 20. And I see this with some people, you know, because they get really strong by 20. And then, you know, from 20 to 25, it's not like you're just going to exponentially explode again. I mean, you maybe could, but it just becomes less likely, especially if you've already been training for a little while and you got really strong fast. Because then, like, you probably sustain your first injury, you know, maybe not a major one, but a minor one, or something tweaks or something doesn't work out well. And then you have to kind of change your training. And then it's not the, you know, and then you basically have to experience adversity at some point, you know, in some way, shape, or form. You know, within that period, you're going to get tested in some way. And, you know, people will decide to, you know, stick around, stick it through, and, you know, continue to compete and try to figure it out. And others will say, this is a sign for me to, you know, bow out, or I'm more interested in something else. And that's, you know, okay too. I mean, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with either of those things. But that is where you begin, I think, to see a lot of the separation is like about 2 years into competing or so, probably. If I had to guess, probably like 2 or 3 years into it.
So I'm curious with you, Shane, like, what are your motivations behind lifting? Why do you want to pursue powerlifting, and what is it about it that you enjoy?
Well, similar to what Ashton was just saying, I actually sort of thought I was done with powerlifting at a very young age. When I was 16, I just kept hurting my back, and I didn't have really any guidance. I didn't have really a coach at the time, and I just sort of made up my mind that after a few repetitively tweaking my back and just being in discomfort, being so young, I thought, well, powerlifting is just, and it is the common thing, like lifting heavy weights, you're going to hurt your back. You know, a lot of older people, my parents included too, kind of, you know, they're like, what are you doing? And I decided to do track and field. I decided to become a thrower, and I did that for my last 2 years of high school, and I enjoyed it immensely. It was actually very similar to powerlifting, and I got to a point while I was throwing that I kind of realized there is a workaround. There's a way to still, and I went back to lifting weights. I wasn't competing in powerlifting at the time, but I still lifted weights. I was squatting, benching, deadlifting during my entire throwing career, my 2 years of high school career. But I do think that I had a block, like a mindset block, where I was like, if I lift heavy weights, I'm going to get hurt. And then that's evolved over time to, there is a way to do this. You just have to adapt your approach. You have to, you know, potentially reduce certain things like volume, intensity, frequency. You have to manage those things because they all work together. You know, they all are going to impact you. So you have to find the right balance. I'm not really built to be a power lifter. I'm like 6'1", 6 feet tall. So that too, I think that I have to train a little bit differently. I don't think I'm built to be squatting 2 or 3 times a week just with there's something to be said for like gaining shoulder mobility and stuff like that, but low bar back squatting for me is usually like a once a week thing, and I might even substitute high bar a lot of weeks just to feel a little bit better on my shoulders, on my elbows, everything like that. So I think that it was mostly, I sort of viewed it as impossible when I was younger. Like if I try to lift heavier weights, I'm just going to keep hurting myself. And I found a way to make it work. And now being a coach, that's my primary, business that I do is online coaching. So to play that part and to kind of help people adapt their mindset and their approach to training so that they can continue to train if they wish to. Like, I think there's nothing wrong with if someone finds other things. And like you said, just as you get older, you find different interests. There's absolutely nothing wrong with leaving powerlifting. But if it is your goal, and I think for me as a young kid, it was my goal, but I thought it wasn't possible. So I want to kind of, if I can, help to shift the mindset of a lot of people to view powerlifting as something that can enhance your life. It's not going to necessarily break you, I mean, it can. I think absolutely it can. But a lot of that is your approach to lifting. If you approach it in a certain way, I think you can be a lot more, it can enhance resiliency, There's certain lifters, like I know Ashton knows, I don't know if you know Peyton, David Ricks. He's well into his 60s, still competing, squats over 700 pounds in the USAPL. I think he's 62.
Yeah, he's in his mid 60s. Yeah, he's older.
It's insanely inspiring to see someone continue, not just to lift, but to be incredibly strong,
Mm-hmm.
So
still benches like mid 400s, like low mid 400s. Yeah.
When did he start?
Decades ago. Before any of us were born. Yeah, by like a lot.
3 or 4 decades he's been at it. Yeah. Crazy.
I met a dude like that. I remember when I was competing when I was younger. I think his name was Mark Ferris, and he was like in his 50s, and he had done over 150 powerlifting meets, and he was still pulling. I think he's actually like when he did it, I think he was like the oldest person to pull 700 or something like that. And but I remember he was the one I learned how to deadlift fast from. I remember asking him, like, he just pulled so explosively, and I asked him, like, what is it? What's the magic? And he said, just pull fast. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, don't overthink it. And he's like, just pull fast. And he was like, whether it's the warm up, whether it's the heavyweight, he said, pull it as hard and as fast as you can. He said, obviously good technique. And then he mentioned like he likes bands and chains and stuff like that, but he was like, yeah, just pull fast. And I was like, all right, that sounds like, okay, we'll see. And I started doing that the next year. And all of a sudden I became like the most explosive lifter I had seen around me. And I remember like watching guys deadlift in the low 800s, and I was pulling my warm-ups faster than them, like all the way to like 500s and 600s. And I was like, wow, it worked. I was like, that's all there was to it.
Yeah. No, I mean, sometimes it's so much more simple than we think. I really like what Shane mentioned, and I want to harp on this. The leverage aspect, I think, in powerlifting sometimes can be really overlooked. So in my opinion, I think the 3 most important, like the top, if I had to make a hierarchy of things that are really important in powerlifting, the top 3 things in this order, and I'm totally free to debate it, but number 1, I think, is leverages. I think in powerlifting, leverages is key. Like, that's the most important like aspect. And this is like, of course, this list omits like things like mentality and approach and things like that. So number 1, leverages. Number 2, muscle mass. And then number 3, technique. I think to make the best powerlifters, like in that order, I think those are the 3 most important things. And you have to work around those things, in order to bring sort of your best self to the platform. Like, so for Shane, for instance, and I've seen him in person, Shane's about 6'1" and, probably anywhere between like circa 260, 270s, right? If you're that size and you lift as much weight as he does, squatting, one, you're traveling further than most people. And depending on, femur length, leg length, abdomen length, etc., a heavy low bar squat, especially, is going to affect him differently than it affects a lot of other powerlifters. There's powerlifters in Shane's weight class that are like below 5'10", and they're like 275, and I don't know how they do it. You know, I don't know how they do it. I could never, you know, it's not for me, but some folks do it, and I'm not knocking it, but I couldn't. You know, their squat leverages are much different, so they can probably squat heavier more often, one, and two, you know, do more volume and train more frequently because their levers are just better for it. Of course, you know, the amount of weight you're lifting is also a factor, but yeah, leverages are like massive and can really sort of, you know, and that's why people always try to manipulate them. You know, they try to arch big when they bench, they try to bench wide, they try to, you know, when they deadlift, of course, you know, like if you do hook grip, for instance, they try to manipulate it by setting the bar in the lowest part of the hand, so you travel the least amount of distance and don't rip your thumbs in the process. And you know, for squat, you know, there's similar things. People will try to set the bar lower and lower on their back, and they try to bring their arms in as close as possible. Sometimes, you know, they manipulate their leverage in any way possible, so it's easier to lift more weight. You know, that's sort of like the in-game strategy. People manipulate leverages in powerlifting, and this is, I think, one of the issues. A lot of young kids, especially that are getting into it, will be more focused on manipulating leverages to lift more weight faster and to be competitive faster than to manipulate muscle mass to gain more muscle. You know what I mean? When I was younger in training, I was worried about gaining more muscle mass, and in the long run, that served me really well. My leverages, I would say, for lifting generally are good. Like, I've seen people with better squat leverages. I've definitely seen people with better bench leverages, and I've seen people with better deadlift leverages, but they're good enough, and I have enough muscle mass, you know, more muscle mass than most people, to where I can almost sort of compensate if certain people have better leverages than I do in a lot of the lifts. And, you know, Shane is probably the same way, you know, doesn't have, you know, great leverages for, you know, squat or deadlift, or, well, pretty good for deadlift, but not great for squat, not great for bench, decent for bench, but so strong, can do so much weight. He has a lot of muscle mass. And, you know, and you can, you know, somewhat manipulate the leverage, you know, aspect at that point and try to lift weight more efficiently. And if you have more muscle mass to do it, then, you know, you're going to be better at it. So for me, I think a lot of people that are younger that don't have a lot of muscle mass focus on just manipulating leverages without building muscle, and they focus on hyperspecificity and all this other stuff. And I don't know, in the long run, you know, I don't think that's the right approach. I think, you know, building muscle mass when you're younger and having that sort of cushion there is really important. But that's kind of sort of how I feel about that.
I agree 100%. I think a lot of people have said this for years, that the weight classes are more so height classes. So take an average of, you know, maybe the top 5, top 3, whatever you want in each weight class. How tall, what's the average height? If you're that height, to be your best to be the best you can be, you're probably going to be around that height. And there's some exceptions, obviously. There's some guys that are, you know, pretty tall that are in some of the lighter weight classes, but generally you see, as the weight classes go up, so does the height. It corresponds heavily, just your height and your weight, obviously. So I think a lot of people, like when they begin, like Ashton's saying, when you start to maximize your leverages, it's probably going to be easier to do that if you're using techniques that allow for more range of motion. So a closer grip bench, a narrowish grip, a narrowish stance squat, maybe a conventional deadlift. Those things are great for building your base. And then once you do build that base, I think then it would be more appropriate to start, once you're, you know, a higher level lifter, really start to manipulate leverages to try to maximize your strength. But I think you would agree, Ashton, that training both variations is also really important. So even at your level, training, like you train a good bit of high bar, you can deadlift both ways. I think that's very valuable, to have that diversity of movement that you can play with. Like if you have, say maybe you had like an adductor strain or something, you usually pull conventional anyway. But say something was bothering you with sumo, doesn't matter, just pull conventional. Yeah. Say you tear your thumb pulling hook grip, it's like, I'll just pull mixed grip. It's like you have more options. You know, you have more freedom and more ability to maneuver around things when you have that movement diversification, you know.
I agree. I agree like a lot. And I think there's a balance to strike there too. Because you want to be really good at one generally, and it should be really reliable. But if it does happen to fail for whatever freak reason, which has happened in like 2 meets, I think, then you can just go the other thing and it'll work out. And then it'll be okay, you know. Like excuse me, at nationals this past meet. So truth be told, I was in Vegas and I had a good time every day going into the meet, including the night before. And it severely affected, what I was able to do on the day. We get it. So, bench like had went so well in training leading up to the meet. And I was using the widest grip I had used in a very long time. I was using my ring finger on the ring. And, bench was feeling phenomenal. I mean, I was just crushing it. The weights were moving. Everything felt easy. Great momentum. I get to the meet and like 2 reds feels hard. And I'm like, oh boy, I lost weight. I'm dehydrated and this doesn't feel good. So the first 2 attempts, I take it with that grip and I'm like, I can't do this right now. And so my last attempt, I bring it all the way in and I get the weight, increase the rack height, like 4 pins and then bring my grip all the way in and then I get it. But it's like, to speak to Shane's point, like I had that in my back pocket because I still trained it once a week. And for me, that grip on bench for some reason, I think because of a muscle mass thing is in just generating force, like it's a really reliable lift for me. So even if it's a little bit less, it's reliable. Like close grip bench, if both are trending well, close grip bench, probably a little bit less, but also super reliable versus wider. Same thing with deadlift, my sumo top end strength sumo is probably higher. And but conventional for me is more reliable, from a technical standpoint, from a strength standpoint, it's more reliable. And then squat, squat, low bar and high bar both tend to be pretty reliable for me, but I like to use high bar because like Shane, I can't train low bar like more than once a week. It'll just absolutely wreck me. Even if it's like not heavy, I don't do it. Training high bar is so much better. And, I like it more for building muscle and it doesn't, fatigue certain areas as much as when I'm training low bar. So it's a really good workaround for me.
What would you say, like, why can't you do low bar more than once a week? What is it for you? Like, for me, it's like mostly my biceps, like my elbow. It's like the proximity is like to the elbow joint, because of the low bar position and everything like that. What is it for you?
I never had really the issue with the elbow squatting low bar ever until I tried it and I benched heavy close grip like 3 days a week. That's when it started to affect me. And then I had to go a little bit wider on my grip on low bar. And as I got heavier too, that was another thing. I've also had to go a little bit wider on the grip. Because, if you're not like tall, if you're like an average height dude, but you're like 220, 230, and your chest just gets like really, like my chest is over 50 inches. So like I have to, like when I'm like getting, like setting up for squat, if I do this or try to do any of that low bar, it's going to just tear all of that up. So I like widened the grip a little bit and it's really comfortable for me. And the other thing too is honestly like low back, hips, low back and hips mainly. And even middle back too, like honestly just my whole back. We'll go with that. My whole back and my hips. If I like squat heavy low bar twice a week instead of once, and I'm deadlifting heavy and I'm, doing other stuff like, cardio running or whatever, or wrecking, then yeah, it squatting low bar more than once a week takes away from that really good balance. And then it just totally wrecks my body. So I can't do it. I mean, I can, but it'll hurt.
It's not as sustainable. That's what I find. Like if I get to the point where it's like pretty inflamed, then even doing once a week, it can until it, kind of settles down. But once I've settled into that, like once a week low bar and even doing a lot of like back downs, high bar, I feel really good, much more sustainable.
Yeah, I agree. Honestly, I can't even remember the last time I squatted low bar twice a week. That might've been like 5 years ago.
Wow.
Yep, I just do high bar the other day. It works. It's for me, it's a good formula. You just punch the buttons and it works. Yeah.
Shane, what frequency do you train each main movement and how many days per week do you train?
So right now, 4 days a week total, but I was training more like 6 days a week. When I was dealing with my back injury, I was benching like 4 times a week. I was benching every other day, just consistently, 1 day off and then back on it. And I was doing like leg accessories about twice a week. So it was 6 times a week, but now that I'm in meet prep and we are pushing the intensity a little bit more, 4 times. So we have 2 bench days, heavy and a light bench day. I'm doing close grip on the light day, and then 1 squat and 1 deadlift day.
That's a pretty good formula right there. Yeah. And you've got 2 extra days of rest, and yeah, that should help with like recovery, healing, and it sounds like yeah, it makes sense.
Do either of you ever deadlift twice a week?
I used to. I actually, going into the hybrid showdown about a year and a half ago, I had some of my best deadlift progress ever doing twice a week. I had like a rep day, and then I was deadlifting on my SBD day. And on the rep day, was normally on the stiff bar, and I was using straps, and I was doing somewhere between 5 and 8 reps. And I made tremendous progress, but it wasn't sustainable. So I think it did serve me at the time. I got really strong, but I could not sustain that.
Yeah, I had a super similar thing. Like what I would do is I would actually train sumo and conventional once a week each. So I would technically deadlift twice a week, but I would put a little bit more intensity and emphasis on the one I wanted to compete with. And then the other one I would just train with, slightly less intensity and decent, volume. Or like reinforced technique or, other things. That was really helpful and useful for a while. And I could probably go back to a system like that eventually, but with conventional, it's kind of like that low bar for me. I don't really like to train that twice a week, unless it's like RDLs, and I can't go super, and I don't try to go super heavy on the RDLs either, because I can RDL so much, but like I have to, if I want the primary day to show up, then I have to control and scale the intensity on the RDLs or stiff legs or whatever. Because if I'm like stiff legging or RDLing like 650 for 5, it's cool, but it's gonna absolutely murder your primary day and your squat, or you're just not gonna feel the same. So, do like I like to do like 3 plates or 3 plates and a quarter, 4 plates, get like a little bit of higher reps in. That kind of helps me a lot. If I pull twice a week, but once a week works too for me.
I was gonna say I am training all the muscle groups twice a week, but I'm not training like the movements. Like we have like 1 squat day, 1 deadlift day, but both those days I am training like anterior and posterior chain. So like on my squat day, I'm doing GHRs, a decent bit of volume of those, and then on the deadlift day, I'm doing a little bit of SSB before I deadlift. So there's still like a 2 times a week frequency for the muscle groups, but only 1 time a week frequency for the movement itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah. That's a good approach at your strength level too. That makes sense.
I was gonna say similar probably to what Ashton experiences, like with doing like 315 and doing like reps and stuff. That like higher rep day or higher volume day, more like blood flow, kind of like facilitates recovery in a way, but it's also a different stimulus. Like it's more of a hypertrophic stimulus, but it also all that blood flow and just movement does seem to also stimulate recovery.
Yeah,
active recovery stuff.
Absolutely.
So both of you mentioned doing an SBD day, and I feel like back when I powerlifted, I didn't know of many people who did that, but it seems like it's more common now, and it seems like the importance of it is for the specificity of meet day. So I was curious to hear like both of your guys' experience with SBD days.
I think Ashton should go first because he's been doing it way longer than me, and he used to have those like those infamous SBD days every weekend. We'd wait for him.
Yes, as Shada said, I want to say for the past 5-ish years, I've been doing them, because what you're saying is true, or at least I think it is. Like way back when, like 8 years ago, 9 years ago, 7 years ago, I did not see a lot of dudes just doing SBD days. Maybe they were, and we just didn't see them, but I didn't see them anywhere. They would have a squat day, they would have a deadlift day, they would have, a bench day. Maybe they would have a squat and deadlift day, where one is lighter and the other is heavier. But an actual just full on SBD day, you very rarely saw. My thinking was at meets, an issue I started to run into, I'm like, if I'm hitting this weight on deadlift in the gym, how come it's so hard to hit 30 pounds less than the meet? And for me, it was like, I think that for me, it was partly mental and partly that I was getting exhausted because, meet day is different, you know, and pacing is one thing. So how fast you're lifting. And another aspect is that you're doing all three lifts on the same day. And in my mind, I'm like, well, hell, why don't I just one day a week, I stroll in the gym, I train all three lifts, and I go at a pretty fast pace. Because if I do that, I'll be ready for any meet, you know. And it works. It served me well. So what I did was I started with a rather lighter intensity, but a little bit more, volume and stuff like that. And but I would never usually do a whole lot of reps. Like when I first started it, I would do like 5 sets of 3 or something like that. And it would be at like a lighter weight, like 70%, 65%. And I would start there and I would build on that. And then I eventually got into doing singles. I'm like, well, the meet, you're doing singles, 3 singles for each lift. So why don't I just work at singles of varying intensities and increase the intensity over time and see how long I can do that until I need to stop and start over. And during that time period, I was generally finding that I could go for 5 to 6 weeks pretty hard, and then I would need to start over. Whereas now I find that 3 to 4 weeks is a lot more manageable than 5 to 6 because my strength level has changed since then. Oh, he'll be back. Yeah. And I think that they certainly have their place in training. I think that they can be an extremely useful tool. I think it doesn't matter as much for the newer lifter per se, as long as they're just training and gaining progress. I think things are fine and you don't need to overthink things. But I do think if you, compete 1 or 2 times and you find that, hey, like I'm a little exhausted by deadlifts or this meet is really fast, then I think those are good prompts to change the way that you're training. And that's sort of what I did. I tried to be proactive to that. So I would do SBD days. I would manipulate the time I would rest between sets. I would try to get through an SBD day and say, I'm like, all right, if this is a heavy SBD day, if I finish it in under 3 hours, which most fast-paced meets are about 3 hours, then I'm in the green. You're good. So I try to finish them in 30 minutes less than that usually, and that's what I would go for. And as I did that more and more, you may take a little bit of a hit at first, but once you practice it, it's kind of like a skill. You get better at it, then you just get better at it, basically. That's pretty much what happened in my case. I got better at it, and it's really served me well for a lot of meets, and it's made meet day performance a lot more predictable than it otherwise would have been, because those Saturday sessions are basically meets. And you're like, well, on this day where I was peaking and stuff, I performed, I hit these numbers, and I did these warm-ups and these attempts. So assuming that I show up to the meet more well recovered, and ready to go, soaking in the atmosphere, all this stuff, mindset is right. If I replicate these same numbers that I did that heaviest SBD day, I should fall within these ranges or categories. And 9 times out of 10, I'm pretty accurate with that. There's like the one-offs, like nationals, obviously, where I totaled like 100 and like something pounds less than I wanted to because of what I mentioned. But like, the Arnold, the Virginia Pro, and a bunch of other meets that I've done, it was pretty methodical. And because I had those Saturday sessions as good data, I was able to generate and sort of calculate ranges where I think that I would fall no matter what. And that's kind of how I approached that.
I have 2 questions for you. The first one is, do you always do it in the order of squat, then bench, then deadlift? And then the second one is, when you're peaking for a meet and you're taking your big lifts for the week, do you always do it on that day?
The day of the meet?
No, like for example, like as you're peaking for the powerlifting meet and you're starting to hit some heavy singles or heavy doubles, are you always doing it on the SBD day?
Oh, okay. So generally, yes, to the second question. Those will all generally fall on the same day. And there's usually one other day a week where I'll do the other lifts too, 2 for bench usually. Uh, and to answer the first question, I know sometimes I post them out of order and that might confuse people. And I get that. Sometimes I just post them in the order that I think, that I was happiest with or most impressed with. But that's why bench is always in the middle. um, but no, I always go in order: squat, bench, and deadlift, just like you would in a meet. I never manipulate the order. And for me, minus this one like little mini training cycle in Texas that I did that was like beltless and sleeveless and stuff, which that whole training thing was honestly ruined by other stuff that was going on in my life. But again, whole different story. But those like 4 weeks where I deadlifted, like, beltless, and no straps or whatever, like when I was doing that, or no wraps, I never use straps, but when I was doing that, that was the first time, and I think again, like 3 or 4 years where I actually deadlifted without squatting beforehand. So every deadlift I've done in the past 4 or 5 years, minus that 4 week period, I've always done either at the end of an SBD or after a squat. I've never just walked in the gym and just deadlifted for 4 years, 4 or 5 years. And I'm not saying it doesn't work. It totally does. It's fine. And I think there's something to managing fatigue to where you show up and you can kind of train that lift the best and progress it the best. I think there's a good argument to be made for that. So I think either way really works. But for me, in my situation, competing and wanting to put up the most predictable performances possible and stuff like that, I've found that training deadlift already fatigued to some extent, has always been the best approach for me to predict meet day performance.
I've found with myself that I just deadlift usually better when I've squatted before. It might be because I might rush my warm-ups if I'm excited to just go deadlift something heavy. But there have been a few times when I feel good and I think I'm going to deadlift well, and it's like I almost would have done better if I was fatigued or just more warmed up from squatting first. Almost all my best deadlifts have been after squatting. And I think, just like you said, for specificity and for conditioning's sake, being able to deadlift after you squat is definitely important as a powerlifter, as a 3-lift powerlifter, But I think for me, it's almost always better. I almost always deadlift better having squatted first. Not always maximal, but just some form of squatting,
I think there's something to that. I think back to some of my best deadlift sessions I've ever had, and they were after like let's say I like squatted high bar, like 500s or 600s for like a set of like 3 to 6 reps or whatever. I'm like in a good rhythm and stuff like that. I've warmed up, I've lifted some, and I start warming up for deadlifts, and I start at like maybe 3 plates or 2 plates, and I'm just feeling just crispy, crispy in a good way, Like there's one day where I almost pulled 900. I got really close. I felt good for it on the day, actually. I think I just took too many jumps, like attempts before it, because I had no plan to do that day. Don't do that, kids. But that day again, it was like I had a good high bar squat session beforehand. It wasn't maximal or anything, but did like a good amount of weight, did like a set of 3 or 4 or something, and then went to do sumo, and then like shit was just flying. I mean, it was, so I find that too, like some of my best deadlift sessions, conventional and sumo, are after I've squatted. And again, not like a max, not like, well, sometimes a max actually, but most of the time not a max. And yeah, I've also found that I deadlift better like that sometimes too. So I think there's something to it. I know some people are so used to just deadlifting just by itself, and they get really good at it, and then they get in a meet and their deadlift just like tanks. But ever since training like that, that hasn't been the case for me.
Yeah, I find with deadlift, it's usually the lift that people have the biggest, to their squat, bench, deadlift. Sometimes people will squat more, but usually deadlift's the biggest one. So people tend to take big jumps. And I know you're a fan of big jumps. I'm a fan of taking big jumps. But usually only if I'm already properly warmed up. Like if you're not warmed up and you take big jumps, those big jumps can really, really hit you, And I've done that before. Sometimes where like the heart rate's barely up. You're just, just walk in the gym and deadlift. And for me, it almost never goes well. It's just, I think, especially like you were saying, with like some mid-range squats where you're strong, they're feeling springy, they're feeling You know, the speed is good. You know you're kind of primed and you're ready, and you can take those bigger jumps on deadlifts, just kind of get right into the main work versus spending a lot of time warming up the actual, like you said, starting at 2 or 3 plates. If you've already squatted up to 600, you could probably start at 600 on deadlift, and it's, you know, but you could probably start with a similar weight on deadlift and, you know, jump right in and be fine.
Yeah, totally. I 100% agree. Yeah, it's almost really like a warm up. The whole meet is like a warm up for deadlifts in a way. Yeah, no, 100%.
My kind of perspective on it is the squat and deadlift obviously are very similar, hip and knee dominant, hinge, knee flexion, hip flexion, knee extension. So the squat is basically just like a deeper deadlift. I mean, it's obviously somewhat different too. I'm getting to the point where my squat and deadlift are fairly similar, like in stance width. Sumo, I have a fairly narrow sumo. I'm trying to experiment with a wider stance squat. But I just find that I always have about 150-ish, 125 to 150 pounds between the two, squat to deadlift. And I almost consistently, like if my squat goes up, I know my deadlift, as long as grip is there and everything like that, I know my deadlift has gone up about, I would say always, usually pretty consistent in the same range.
Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
I feel like the squat is more of a necessary movement, where I think you could build a great deadlift just from squatting a lot. Whereas I don't think the opposite is true. I don't think you could build a great squat with just deadlifting.
Just deadlifting a lot? Yeah, no way.
But I think we've seen some examples of people, weightlifters, for example, like Clarence Kennedy, squatting all the time, obviously doing some level of pulling, like with clean and jerks, but not really training any deadlift, and then still, when he wants to, can go and deadlift mid 700 pounds, 750 pounds. So I think that's a lot of that is just the fact that squatting is such a basic movement, such a human movement, that's going to really make your whole body, you know, stronger. Whereas deadlift will too, but it won't carry over to the squat in the same way. Just because with the squat, you're maximizing, especially if you're squatting deep, you're getting into full knee flexion, full hip flexion. You know, you're moving the biggest joints in your body. So
yeah, no, 100%, man. Like I really feel this similarly about squat. And if I had to pick one of the 3 to do for the rest of my life, I would do squat. So squat is actually my favorite of the big 3. I'm going to be upfront. I love deadlifts, right? You know, if I had to do an FMK, you know, you guys know what that is, right? You know, fuck, marry, kill. If I had to do, you know, with like SBD, you know, like, you know, fuck, would definitely be deadlift. Excuse my language, all viewers. Mary would definitely be squat, kill, bench. I do like bench. I love bench. Don't get me wrong, but if I had to pick, that's how it would break down. I'm being honest about it. But definitely would marry squats. Squats are like, you know, I always say this and it sounds kind of goofy. Like I've seen a lot of dudes deadlift 700, not a lot of dudes, but I've seen some dudes deadlift, you know, 700 pounds that, you know, look unassuming, right? And it's nothing against them, but they look unassuming, like they don't look strong or very strong. But I've never seen a guy squat 700 pounds to depth look that way. You know what I mean? Like, have you ever seen a guy who squats 700 that just looks small? Not like
really.
but just fast. Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen it. You know? Like there's something about just loading up that weight and it's on your back. And you're going all the way to, you know, to near the floor with it and then coming back up with it. Like with deadlift, of course, yeah, you're lifting it off the floor, but with squat, as you know, Shane was mentioning, it probably carries over to deadlift more than vice versa because, you know, there's just a lot more work that you're doing over time. And yeah, I've just noticed that, you know, I've seen dudes that deadlift 700 and they're very small, you know, I don't mean that as an insult, but it's just like body weight and stuff like that and muscle mass, they're smaller. And then, but none of them squat 700, you know, like it's a different animal.
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, if you look at the all-time world records in powerlifting, you'll notice that the deadlift will cross 700 like way sooner than the 700-pound squat. Like there's guys, I think in like I can't remember what the weight classes are specifically when you're down like 130, 140 pounds, but like there's guys who pulled 700, like in that range, loose below 150. And like, I don't know if anyone squatted 700 in that range.
Right. I was going to say, I think one of the things is with the bench and the deadlift, you can significantly reduce range of motion with like very wide stance, very wide grip. With the squat, you can reduce range of motion some, put the bar really low, go as wide as possible. But I think the percentage that you can reduce range of motion is much less than both deadlift and bench. Whereas on squat, you're not going to be able to minimize it by enough to make that big of a difference.
Yeah.
You know?
On squat, you can't hide. It's gonna come out. Like, yeah. It's always the first lift of the meet too, so it's always fun to watch. Yeah. One thing I was thinking about though, when you were talking about differences in strength and stuff too. And I think this varies for people. Like for some people, I think it's a bigger difference than others. For me, I wouldn't really know right now because I haven't like used like this equipment so much in a while. But like with the squat, like how do you like the squat bar? Like for you and your experience?
I personally don't like the squat bar much at all.
That's interesting.
It's thicker, so it sits a little bit different on the back. I find I actually put it a little bit higher on my rear delts, like a very, very small amount, but a tiny bit higher. And it's just a little bit thicker of a bar to grab around, which I'm just not used to. Even now, I'll train on the power bar sometimes when I'm not really close to meet, because I like it more. I think the Ohio power bar is the best bar probably ever made. But no, I don't enjoy the squat bar. I used to always be under the impression that it had a higher like tensile strength, but it was a stiffer bar.
They don't. Most don't.
I know. I always thought it was, and I used one. I'm like, this is the whippiest bar I've ever squatted with. Like, what is this? I actually, one of the first times I ever used one, I actually traded my friend a Westside power bar and an Ohio bar. So like $700 basically worth of barbells for a squat bar. And then I was like, I hate this bar. I don't like the squat bar.
You literally traded gold for.
I know.
Yeah,
but you've used it too, right? You've used it a little bit.
I have. I do notice as well, like especially with tensile, it gets so important when you're squatting really heavy, especially like there's just such a difference, squatting 700 on a Texas power bar than on an Ohio than like on a Kabuki power bar. Like there's differences, there's levels to it. And for me, it's so bizarre because despite the tensile strength problem with squat bars, I actually squat phenomenal with squat bars. Like once I got heavier, like when I was lighter, like I hated squat bars. I was kind of on the same boat as you. Like they sit awkward on your back. They're funny. But like when I got heavier and like broader and stuff, like squat bars now, I squatted on one for a little bit because I wanted to do that one meet. I think it was the showdown. But I couldn't because I literally couldn't travel because I had like training and stuff. But man, the few sessions I squatted on it, it was amazing. And then the deadlift bar felt the same way for me, like especially the Texas deadlift bar. The Kabuki one I've never used, but I'm not sure if I would like it, to be honest, just because of how long and thin it is. Yeah. I feel like at heavier weights you'd have to be really careful and just like not be the speed lifter that Peyton was when he was deadlifting back then, because whip would throw you off. But like with the Texas deadlift bar, like I love, like damn, like that thing feels phenomenal when you deadlift on it. So I know for me, the squat bar I really like, the deadlift bar I really like. I think it's interesting. I think that the difference between my squat and deadlift may be just like marginally more if I use the squat and deadlift bar. Whereas on the power bar, I think it inhibits my squat a little bit sometimes. And for deadlift, I don't think it's that far off, honestly, but it's a little bit different, I guess. But like strength level, because I know over the years my squat has gotten really close to my deadlift now. I'm almost like super heavyweight syndrome where like, a lot of them have like heavier squats. And I'm like 230 or like, this doesn't make sense, but it's happening. That's another thing too. If your squat progresses a lot too, it's also going to affect how your deadlift progresses, I think, especially when you're squatting like really like heavy weight. It is different deadlifting 800 and squatting 600s than deadlifting 800 and squatting 800 for sure. But yeah, no, I was just curious about that because I know that some different, like the different feds use different stuff. And I know Dawson, I talked to him, he hates the squat bar too. So I
Yeah,
was
we both
curious
don't.
if you were probably on the same boat as him. But yeah, I don't know. I used to hate the squat bar, but now I really like it. But I haven't used it in a while, so I'm not too sure, I guess. But I was curious about that, so I had to ask.
I have opened my grip up a little bit, trying a wider like foot position. I find that having the hands wider and the feet wider, they kind of go in line with each other. And I found that is much easier to manage the whip of the squat bar by just opening the grip up, because then everything that's kind of under the bar is more spread out versus, because it's a longer bar too. I think it's a 35 millimeter diameter, but it's also, I think, a full foot longer than a power bar.
It's thicker and it's about longer. Yep.
Right. So having the hands wider, I think, does contribute a little bit to making it easier to stabilize. Just open up, like you were saying, with the chest and the chest growth going a little wider always feels a little better, more open, less kind of folded over position.
That makes sense, because as I got heavier, my grip got wider. So when I squatted on it, my grip was wider than it used to be, and it felt a lot more comfortable. So that makes sense.
I never thought about the grip affecting the whip, but that makes complete sense. Especially if, like, some people, they can get the super narrow, like hand width, and you've got all that whippiness out on the sides. But if you can come on out, and especially if you're locked in like that, you're pretty much like holding the whip down.
Yeah, and I'm one where I can go pretty close, but it's very common for me, if I go really close, that my elbows will not stay, my humerus will not stay kind of parallel to my torso. And I'll get a lot of it'll turn into a good morning. Basically, the squat will become very ugly. So it's much easier for me. Also with bracing, I find it much easier to brace if my hands are a little more open and not so kind of constricted in here, opening everything up.
I found the same thing when I squat, man. Like I see people, they're like super narrow. I'm like, how do you do? Like, I mean, I can get really narrow as well. I have the capability to do it, but my bracing is so awful when I try to do that. I'm like, how do you guys do that? They're like, oh, I get tighter when I do that. I'm like, I don't know how. I can't do it. Like, I have to be like, when I'm a little bit wider, I actually brace so much better and can control whip so much better than if I'm too narrow. So yeah, this is all starting to click for me. I think what you brought up makes a lot of sense.
Do you think that might be weight class? Like the bigger you are, the easier it's going to be to brace by having a little bit wider. Do you think like guys who are smaller might benefit more from being close, or do you think wider in general would help you brace better?
Probably smaller, because if we're going with the concept of just kind of spreading everything, like if you're smaller, there's not a lot to spread. So so having the best central gravity, I guess, would be the concept there, or something along those lines. So for me, being a lot heavier and broader than I used to be, assuming a wider grip, if we're just kind of going in line with Shane's hypothesis about hand placement and width on the bar and stuff like that, would be better. So yeah, I would think the smaller you are, the safer you are to go more narrow.
I agree. I think if you look at a lot of equipped IPF lifters, they squat with an extremely narrow grip. Their elbows like almost touch their legs. They're very elbows under them. And I think that that kind of, and they deal with extremely heavy weights, much heavier than like their raw weights. Sometimes watching those power bars bend is absolutely insane with the equipment. But even a lot of those bigger guys, they have exceptional mobility. So I think it is dependent on also just if you can achieve that position without getting a lot of torso extension, I think then you can still maintain a very good brace. But I think, like for me, for example, I can get that position, but I can't get it without getting at least some amount of extension. And that extension makes it much harder to brace and create that intra-abdominal pressure when you're like arching your back slightly, to get into that very close hand position.
So Shane, for you, to what extent, because obviously you have crazy mobility, I'm also curious if your shoulder mobility is just as good as your hip mobility, but how do you feel like that plays into your skill in powerlifting? And then I'm also curious for Ashton, how good your mobility is and sort of like how you guys feel like the mobility interplays.
I think for me, the mobility is more of like because I was talking to Pete Rubish about this, and I never get into those extreme positions really on any of my lifts. I don't even sumo deadlift that wide. I could go wider, but I found that if I go too wide, I don't have as much power. So I could probably get a slightly better position, a little more upright torso, but I don't feel as explosive. My legs aren't as under me. I can't create as much tension. So I think it's a balance. I think the biggest thing the mobility helps me with is like not getting hurt and just having better body awareness, because I never really leverage my mobility under really heavy weights like that. But I do think it helps with the body awareness, and just generally being able to get into those positions is just indicative that the tissues are probably like healthier, and like they, having more versatility and more diversity with your movement, I think contributes somewhat to like resiliency and injury prevention and whatnot.
Yeah. I'm pretty much on the same train of thought and same boat as Shane on mobility. It's kind of funny because it's not actually really something I intuitively think about a lot, but I can deadlift conventional, I can deadlift sumo. I don't like to go super wide sumo, but I can go a little bit wider. I can go narrow. Conventional is the same way. I can even go a little more wider than I usually do and be just fine for the most part. And then squat, I can squat low bar. I can squat with a wider stance. I can squat with a more narrow stance. High bar, I can do the same thing. Bench, I can bench closer. I can bench wider. I just like to bench closer. It looks cool, and you're traveling more distance and doing more work over time. So I kind of just like that whole concept, building more muscle. But no, I mean, yeah, I'm just kind of on the same boat, as Shane on that. Really, outside of that, I really don't overthink that too much, or have really intuitively thought about it a lot in general, actually, which sounds kind of funny because you've been like lifting so long, you think that I probably would, but I guess mobility has never really been an issue for me. And then of course, over the years, I did a lot of like PT and like obstacle courses and a bunch of other stuff, so you kind of have to be somewhat nimble to get through all that stuff. So I figure if I can do all that, then I can, squat, bench, deadlift. Okay. So that's always been sort of my thing.
Yeah, I think talking to some other lifters too that have backgrounds either in like military or just in high school sports, a lot of that and just simply being active is going to contribute to having pretty good mobility.
Yeah.
Like I don't really spend much time doing mobility. I might get on the ground and do a little bit of stretching, like some leg swings before I squat or deadlift. But I'm not out here spending an hour every day statically stretching my hamstrings, doing anything like that. I honestly don't think many people are. Like I was talking to Dan Grigsby, and he has tremendous mobility, but I think he attributes a lot of his mobility to doing track in high school, to playing football, to just being very active and being an athlete. And then like you were saying with doing obstacle courses, like certain activities you're doing are going to have requirements. And if you do them consistently and you just move your body, you're going to have the necessary mobility to do those activities,
Yeah, just living like just a generally active lifestyle. I think if you do that and you can do that successfully without totally breaking your body down, you probably will have good mobility on the other end of it, or at least decent mobility on the other end of it. Decent enough mobility to where you shouldn't be lifting, poorly due to mobility problems, if that's like a thing.
Yeah, because I think something like powerlifting, like you said, is not something you need an exceptional level of mobility for. Something like weightlifting or gymnastics, something like that, you need much, much, much more mobility than you need for powerlifting. Like to squat to depth, like you look at a baby, they can obviously have different leverages and proportions and stuff, but all babies can squat, and people lose that ability, I think, to get comfortably into a body weight squat, mostly because of lifestyle factors, not because they aren't doing X, Y, or Z stretch,
It's because they're just not active, or they just don't squat, or both. Yeah. Pretty much. Well, speaking of which, I've been practicing my power cleans lately, and I've been shocked at the amount of mobility I have still. Like with that movement too, I'm like, wow, this actually looks good. Yeah, but no, I mean, no. If you live a generally active lifestyle, I think that for the most part, mobility shouldn't be, for most people, I don't think it'll be like a major issue. But if you're not very active, and maybe you only powerlift or you just focus sort of on the big three and manipulate leverages and don't really do anything else, then maybe I guess could be more of a problem for those people. But you know, it does kill me. Shane brought this up. It does kill me when I'm like in the gym and I see like a lot of these like younger lifters too. They're like 18, 17, 19, 20, and they're like doing like 30, 45 minutes, hour of like warming up. Like they set all their stuff down in a rack and then they go and they warm up for an hour. I'm like, what are you doing? Like, you should just be able to just kind of get into it. Like, I don't understand this, No, we're warming up. And I'm like, I've literally finished squatting and benching in the time you've been warming up. Like, I don't understand this, but I guess people, I don't know. But I do see it sometimes with younger lifters, like at my, at a couple of the gyms I've been to. And I'm not, I'm poking fun. I'm not, saying anything bad or any nonsense, but I do see it a lot. And I do think that people can be really excessively worried about some things. And it's good that they're trying to do the right thing and trying to be, as strong as they can be, as healthy as they can be. But I think some people just go way overboard with it or are just like kind of misinformed.
Yeah, I think a big part of that is like you don't want to think of your body as being fragile, and the more you think you can manipulate your body by just pushing on it and stretching it and stuff, I think it creates this idea that your body's very, very pliable and very malleable and very, very soft. And there are times when it is, but for the most part, we're very resilient, and I think for powerlifting, you can probably just jump into the activity you're going to do. And, as you progress in like the load, like basically start with the bar, add plates, and that's usually going to be, fairly sufficient in terms of like warming the body up. You don't need to do a lot, or even just walking, something very general. I don't think it needs to be hyper specific. A warm up don't need to be hyper specific. Most likely just getting the heart rate up, start doing the activity, slowly add weight to said activity, and you'll probably be good.
Yeah. I mean, there were times I remember, and maybe I'm a bit of an outlier when it comes to like warming up and stuff, because I can just like jump into things sometimes and it's kind of ridiculous. But like sometimes what I would do, before like PT in the morning, early in the morning, or, before like a lifting session in the evening or something, is I would sit, or while I was driving to the gym, for like 20 minutes or 15 minutes before going into the gym, I would turn the heat on in my car and I would actually get like physically warm, almost to a point of sweating, like right at that sort of precipice. And then I would get to the gym and go inside and just start lifting. And it was like, it always went so well. Like I don't recommend that to anybody, but that's what I've done in the past. And it worked really well for me. As goofy as it sounds. Shane, it's damn good to see you again too in chat.
Absolutely, man. It's been I was so excited when Peyton texted me last week and asked me.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, this has been fun. When I first texted you, I didn't get a response back. I was like, oh, Shane doesn't love me anymore.
you have my old number, right? You have my old phone number? Yeah. No, man, I'll always text you back.
We should do this again. I feel like we can riff for hours.
Oh yeah. Too easy.
Absolutely. We definitely should. Absolutely.